why are we in such a state where we have allowed developer enthusiasm to replace product ownership? That it's not uncommon for teams to get stranded, to get totally beached on bad performance. I think we have a management crisis in Silicon Valley.
Nice to chat with you, Alex. I've been a longtime fan and longer-time viewer of your tweets, and really excited to have this chat.
Thanks, that's kind. And thank you again for organizing it, for having us.
Yeah, super hyped. So I, for those who don't know, have spent most of my time building applications where the average page time like a viewer is on the page for is upwards of an hour plus, where a session is you load one piece of HTML, and then you watch a video there for hours with a super interactive chat with, in the case of Ping, a browser app that loads a bunch of audio-video devices locally and interops with those inside of the browser. We don't expect our users to be on the types of devices, network conditions, experiences that would benefit a lot from just getting clean, simple HTML down from the server. And when I'm building applications, I'm optimizing for how fast can we solve our users' problems, more so than almost anything else. And I'm curious, first and foremost, what are your thoughts on building specifically for long-lived application-like page sessions where the data changes a lot throughout the experience in tools like the ones we're talking about today? Sure.
So by way of background, I've been building applications that, not video applications per se, but sort of that have that style since, we were building, full calendaring email, PIM suites, and business intelligence applications in JavaScript in 2004, 5, 6, folks like Gavin were helping us build the graphics toolkits back when we had to talk to an Adobe plugin to do SVG or to use VML. There was no Canvas, right? Like we were building full email suites in the Ajax era. And so, I used to work on JavaScript frameworks. Some of them you might regret. But so the TLDR is, my take on this is that most of these experiences actually aren't anything new under the sun. Most people working on most software projects now are, if not explicitly redeveloping a site for an employer that's already had one online for a long time, they're building something in the style of something that has existed. So I think there's a really interesting case about this kind of long-lived video session, but I want to step back and say, while that is maybe an interesting sort of branch in the sort of evolutionary tree of the set of things we can do online, there are lots of these other things that have both short and long sessions, right? So you might go to a TikTok page, and so you might consume one video for a couple of minutes versus one video for an hour, right? So the idea that video is this long-lived session idea overall may not necessarily hold. And the same thing is true, for instance, for email, right? Like the other kind of canonical application that we think of that's something that should be an SPA, right? But the distribution of use of something like Gmail is going to be extremely bimodal. Right? I might just click on a link to view one email, or I might just want to see if there's something new in my inbox. And that may also live next to, in the distribution, a whole pile of sessions which have 10, 100, 1,000-minute length, and may feature many, many, many interactions. And so my kind of mental model for how to think about whether or not the trade-offs are good are kind of grounded in the question of how much cost is there per interaction, and that can be something that you could, maybe aside from video playback, model in the sense of, what if I did a full page refresh for this, right? So almost every interaction you can imagine. Did anyone use MapQuest before you had like, okay, yeah, okay. So you kind of have this idea that there is a default way that you could make all these interactions happen that you currently do under a single tap, where there's a loop where you start with the system being interactive, and then you move to acknowledging the interaction, and you start some work, and then you update the user about how that's going, and then you present the work, and then you move back to an interactive state. Now, if you do it as a full page HTTP round trip, that is the full page refresh. And the browser actually handles most of those UI pieces, right? We handle the update the UI to tell you that something's happening, and then like actually like do the work, and then commit it, and then move you back to an interactive state. When you move things into JavaScript on the client side, you can potentially reduce the total time for that. But if you think of more than just one interaction, if you think of a full session, we can start to come up with a little tiny mental model for whether or not something's an appropriate use of technology, right? If I've got a very short session, I'm just viewing one email, why do I have to sit there and watch Gmail or Outlook, wait for 30 seconds while it, carries the bones of an entire civilization up from the depths in order to have one ghostly experience for most of the UI when all I wanted to do was read this 10 kilobytes of text, right? Intuitively to us, it doesn't make sense, but why doesn't it make sense? And so I think there's this little rinky-dink mental model, which is total session costs, that is to say, the amount of work that you have to do, time, resources, whatever, because those things eventually at the limit turn into the same thing, divided by turns around the interaction loop. How many times in a session do I go through that interactive to doing work, to acknowledging the work, to retiring the work, to updating the user, to interactive loop? How many times? And so if you divide total session costs by total session interactions, I think we can start to come up with an intuition about when and where SPAs as an architecture make more sense.
I honestly mostly agree. I think that there's a part of the conversation that we miss here with, like, when we say interaction, I like to use the word change, like things that change on the page, like data that will update because a user did something and the server gives you new info, or like a message comes in through a WebSocket, things like that. But that's one of the two types of ways that a web app changes. The other way is over a time scale, when I, as a CEO of a company, want changes to be made in the product itself, and the speed at which our developers can iterate on that product and introduce new features meaningfully. And I think that the single page app model is beneficial both in how it allows for the application itself to change during a session, but also for me and my team to build and iterate on that application faster over time.
I like the tension in that, because the introduction earlier, maybe skip the part where for the last 6 or 7 years, I've been banging my head against a wall because I've been consulting with teams that have adopted the popular technologies of the day, and they're building applications in lots of different domains, including video, but also, text-based interactivity and social networks and, e-commerce sites and all the rest, right? Like this full diversity of things. Starting on mobile, probably back in 2015, 2016, we were trying to get PWAs into the world. And then more recently, I spend probably about half of my time sitting with teams at Microsoft who are trying to build very sophisticated web applications and trying to get those to be frankly better. Because we all want our apps to be better. And I think pace of change is one way that they get better. But one of the things that I've experienced actually of late has been that teams hit a pretty hard complexity wall. Where I frequently will encounter teams who've got build times that are north of the time that it takes me to recompile Chromium. I have to let that sink in with you because, like, Chromium is the largest code base, at least client side, that I've ever worked in. It's many millions of lines. Doing a single compile on a fast device will take you north of half an hour, 40 minutes on a really fast thing with a good SSD. We can get those build times below 5 minutes with distributed builds and some really sophisticated architecture there. But like a 5-minute build for a website is unacceptable, right? And so I sort of, from that perspective, I think about like what would it mean to be in the hot loop. And I remember when we could still control R, right? When I make a build for my personal website, I want to make sure that it can fully recompile end to end in less than 3 seconds on moderate hardware.
I would accept nothing less.
Okay. And so from that perspective, right, so we agree.
I go as far as half a second. Anything more than that, and you're breaking the feedback loop. And I work really hard to maintain that in all the code bases I touch. I helped get Twitch's hot reload times down from 10 minutes to 4 seconds, and that wasn't good enough for me. So
this idea of we're going to have some special technology that's hot module reload, or something that's going to make the developer's experience different to the end user experience of getting to the same state, from my perspective, indicates a structural failure in our thinking as a community. We have
No. You've touched on one of my topics. So this is actually one of the biggest things that I have against Remix in particular. They're like the one major modern application framework that refuses to honor the value of HMR. They are beginning to notice it sucks because things like CSS changes, having to wait for the browser to refresh, is annoying. And in my case, building video applications where I'm building a WebRTC experience where I have to spin up AV devices, can make sure I have permissions for those, list the devices, identify one, connect to it, create a video track, publish that track, subscribe to additional tracks, and then I want to make CSS changes after that. A refresh, it would, even if I have my build times down to half a second, I have to wait 10 seconds for all of those things to happen due to the nature of the application we're building. HMR lets me do 80% or so of the types of things that I'm working on as a developer every day. And I'd say 1 out of 10 times, I'm like, oh, this seems like it's bugged. I'm going to refresh to see the real state. But HMR isn't like this magical solution that solves the long build time problem. Totally agree. HMR allows me as a developer building applications where the session intro time, just due to the nature of what we're building, is high. It lets me have less cognitive load, interruption, and just general interruption to my workflow as I'm doing the changes I'm doing most of the time.
Would you be willing to stipulate that the case of RTC spin-up is unusual for most web developers?
Yes, but there's something like that in a lot of applications.
So on that point, I think I'm going to disagree.
Not the majority of the web. The majority of web applications that developers are being hired for companies that are making money and iterating on their product right now.
So this is where I think we might get to the core of a disagreement, which is absolutely, if there's some high structural cost thing that's going to be between you and this other thing, then we want better tech to fix it, right? And I would also want the same thing, right? I think we're in total alignment that we want fast reload times. The effect.
Get Remix out, or get React out of e-commerce.
Okay. Are we, hands up, who thinks that React should be banned from consumer e-commerce?
I'm disappointed in y'all.
Is anyone here willing to take the opposite side? Like, why shouldn't it be banned from consumer e-commerce?
Oh, Astro.
So you say Astro is the answer?
We're specifically asking the question of,
React.
what about Astro React?
Astro saves React. It saves, it still allows you to use React, but have a minimal e-commerce run.
Okay, so if I can play that back for the recordings, you can tell me if I get this wrong. The argument is if you use Astro, you can sequester the React pane to the server side where it doesn't cost the client anything, and then you have HTML, and Astro makes it possible to not punish the user with the weight of the output. Is that correct? Okay, all right, so got an agreement, yeah.
You could also use any other JavaScript library at that point. Like, the problem with React isn't like React the thing for defining components. It's when React takes over the architecture and like the root of your DOM node for your entire web application in order for your user to have any interaction whatsoever. And you're blocking user interaction on a giant React payload from a framework that somebody introduced 5 years ago, like Create React App, and then quit 2 years later. And now a bunch of people who don't really know React well are maintaining it, and the site's falling to pieces. React kind of encourages that as a default, which isn't great. And I think if you're picking React, you need to pick it for a reason. And Astro isn't picking React. It's actually explicitly not picking React, but allowing you to pick React in the future.
So it's interesting that you bring up this style of construction. I think that I first recommended a sort of a server-side React tourniquet to a team back in 2016, when they could first kind of do quote-unquote SSR. Because we were seeing these kinds of problems in an e-commerce site where they would get themselves into a place where the developer had believed that moving fast in the addition of features was going to be the thing that caused them to deliver a better e-commerce experience, right? They were building some components. Some of those components had some real sophistication to them. Like they would be like a type of head search box, right? You know, and modulo that we've been building type of head search boxes for DHTML toolkits in 2000, 2001. But put that to the side, it was still easier and faster for them for their specific look and feel, for their design system, for their customization to do it. But they were not a brand selling, Prada handbags. This was a comparison shopping site, like mid-market or below, trying to reach users on devices that are not, that are much more common than the ones that the folks in this room carry. They were targeting outside the privilege bubble.
Absolutely. And if this is a conversation about what helps the average user of the web the most, I will throw my towel in right now. I'm going to lose that battle. If we're talking about what makes the most websites for the most users the best experience, it is deleting my YouTube channel. But that's not what I am here to talk about, and that's not what I spend my time on. I think that, especially with the recently booming tech market, the idea of companies coming in and disrupting the way things worked before, that is usually focused on the higher end of the market, the people who have an iPhone from the last 3 years, in order for people to enter a market. And ideally, with Ping, I would love for us to be successful enough that using React and having upwards of 700 kilobyte JavaScript payload to use our application experience is actually a bottleneck in some of the markets we're hoping to address. But right now, those markets would be too much money to get into and too little return for the size of the product market fit that we have. If your goal from day one is to address those markets, then you need to make really strict technical decisions to make sure you can. But if your goal is to prove out that this thing can work in the first place, maybe you're a small startup like us at Ping, or maybe you're a big company like Google or Microsoft that wants to see if you can disrupt Slack. Using React allows you to do those things faster, and building in this way allows you to iterate on product-wise on those things quicker. And I just have not seen someone move that fast in more any of the technologies that you've mentioned so far.
So that's interesting. So as a result of a lot of this consulting, partially because maybe I have a reputation or because I've made bad choices, I get called in when teams stop having a good time. So a lot of my experience is, I think, something that we don't talk about in this community, and certainly not in the front-end community in general, which is that, and I think at this point I can safely say with high confidence in a way that maybe you should believe, that it's not uncommon for teams to get stranded, to get totally beached on bad performance. And that is to say, the CEO notices on their high-end device, the marketing manager will come back from a holiday with family or friends, and they'll say, gosh, I tried to use the product and it was really slow. Was it just my internet connection? Maybe there was something wrong with the computer? There will be a series of conversations that start to swirl, and someone with some actual power will start to notice, and then the organization has to figure out what the heck is going on. Now, if you've got a latent performance culture, sometimes this gets caught early, but often not. I'm sad to report that even inside of Microsoft, with a really good performance culture, actually, if that performance culture is a performance culture about Win32, it's not a performance culture about web. And so there's kind of a lost in translation moment, and you can feel it in the product. And so there's a thing that keeps happening to teams, and I keep having to coach and consult in these environments where teams get destroyed by the cumulative effects of being able to write a lot of code very quickly, but not being able to run it very quickly. And so one of my experiences, and one of the things that I'm having to coach a lot of folks through, is to get them to understand how browsers actually process the content that we send down the wire, because what you experience as a developer is that you're writing components, you're writing things that are actually isolated from each other, they're individual, but when you run them in the commons. There is no such thing as a React component from the browser's perspective. React doesn't do components. React does a sea of divs, and then it adds a bunch of weight to the sea of CSS. It does not have a component model when we go to run your React code. We see it as an undifferentiated pile of stuff. And that stuff has global side effects. And so when you get to scale, it turns out that React doesn't scale. And so I'm really curious to know the size of the teams that you work in, because one of the things that I see is that React, so far at least, among all of its alternatives, is one of the worst to scale at runtime, because it doesn't encourage any true runtime isolation. And so we're actually sort of trying to plan paths for folks to put things like their React code inside of islands of Shadow DOM, where we can actually start to put some constraints on it. Because from that perspective, we get some semantic transparency. We can start to think about managing the costs in a bucket and getting the browser to help you out, where we're in this old world of today of everything's just adding to this commons and then slightly taxing everything else that's on the page.
I agree with a lot of what you're bringing up here. How do I put this? As for the size of teams thing and the scale thing, I think the problem is you're almost experiencing a survivor bias here, where the companies that got far enough to reach scale are the ones that have to bring in Alex Russell to undo the bad decisions the Theos made. And I would love, again, for more companies to get there, and the ones that I've helped consult with and work for myself, once they get over that hump and they've hit product market fit, and they are actually losing customers and money to the point where they can justify hiring web experts like yourself to help at that point. I think that there is a level of developer awareness that React lets you skip and ship something. The thing won't be as good, but the alternative isn't the developer gets good, learns all the web standards, and ships something better. The alternative is nothing shipped in the first place.
So, okay, let's talk about a hypothetical then. So, I have an existing product. Let's call it exciting. Some ambiance.
Planning?
Let's say I have, an email client, right? This is a thing we do, or maybe it's a document editor, right? Generally long sessions, hard to imagine. We can't imagine doing it without Ajax or SPA. I think for reasons, we'll call them reasons, we all kind of have an aversion to that model for some of this stuff. And that thing is scaled. It's working in the market. Is there a moment where you could recommend that they redevelop it on top of a React stack?
No.
Let's move one step adjacent. Let's say we're talking about a viewer application. So let's say I go to Google Docs and I've got that sort of editing view, and we've just agreed that for an editor we're going to say no. What about for the published document? We say we're just going to go publish something on the internet. Should it ever pull in a copy of React?
It already existed beforehand, and we're rewriting it to do this.
Yeah, we're rewriting it to do this.
Extra no.
Okay. What about? That's pretty close then to a blog. Should a blog ever include a copy of React?
If you're including like some crappy widget that's like, how did you like this post that you imported from a third party that happens to have React in that? Annoying, but if it lets you do that faster, sure. But generally, like if it's an existing blog, should you rewrite your blog in React? If the thing that it's on before is worse and you have a React developer, maybe, but try something better first, see how easy it is to pick up.
Okay, so we're firmly in the zone of where most internet traffic is today, right?
Yes.
Okay. I like this. We've moved the debate to my location.
It's a conversation.
Thank you for agreeing. I see every day huge sites recently rebuilt, and I hear narratives inside of those teams. I will have consulted with many of them, especially if they're like a top 100, 1,000 site. And I'll hear narratives like, again, remember, stable products in the market, in competition, often for speed with other things, saying, well, we had to because we couldn't hire for, I don't know, PHP or HTML or CSS. How do you think about that question? How should we be?
Hire an expert in the problem that you have and have them hire either their friends who are also experts in the problem they have or build new experts internally. You should not be using the flavor of the month to make hiring easier if you have a problem that isn't just the number of engineers.
So let's go to the other side then. We've got these domains that I think we can agree are more speculative, right? Like you're doing a startup, you want to put together a product. It's not a basic CRUD thing, or maybe it is a basic CRUD thing, but it's got some new functionality that's pretty, novel. What's the rubric for you about why you would pick one architecture or stack over another?
Generally speaking, I pick what I and my team gut feel will let us move the fastest in the space that we're in. More often than not, for web applications, that usually right now is something along the lines of what's now coined as the T3 stack, which is React, Next.js, tRPC for API definitions, Prisma for database definitions. Depending on who I'm talking to, any one person can have a massive issue with one part of the stack and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense for the other side. Generally, it lets me and the teams I work with move faster to get something working and working well that scales infra-wise and like team-wise logically enough, but will run into pitfalls like everything from cold start times to compile times on really big applications to Prisma just being Prisma. There are a lot of things that you will inevitably run into when you build in this way. And if what you're building is a basic e-commerce site that's competing with a different market, make a different decision. But I try to think, who is the user of this? What does their use look like? Who are the developers working on this, and what lets them deliver to those users as effectively as possible, considering where we are right now. And if where we are right now is we have no software, React often helps us have software that works well enough earlier for the users who are the most likely able to spend money on it and influence others to use our product. So for something like Ping, where the average user is on a giant beefy gaming PC, and we explicitly ban mobile devices from the site, but they still try their hardest to sneak on sometimes, we had a very specific, like, obvious even path there. And at something like Twitch, where we were originally on Ember and we rewrote to React, that was a huge, risky, controversial decision at the time that we largely made because there was really talented React evangelists that we had acquired from the acquisition of Curse that were excited to port us to React. And more than anything, like excitement-driven development by talented engineers that are certain that they're right goes one of two ways. Either they're right, there's more energy and things start to move way faster, or they're wrong, they learn a huge lesson, and depending on how you scope that investment, that either comes at a huge cost or a small cost, but you're also building trust with the engineers as you do it. That said, I've seen a lot of React rewrites that made no sense at all. Don't want to call it any individual sites, but I've seen some news sites recently rewrite a totally functional HTML-first site in a pile of Next.js that it probably shouldn't have been. And those experiences don't feel great. And generally, if you're rewriting, make the right decision for the rewrite. If you're iterating or trying to find product market fit, use whatever you can to get there as fast as possible, using what you know to make that decision at the time.
I think this is really fascinating, the sort of the journey that you were describing about Twitch, right? So I've seen my share of, still living in a few. So I sit with these teams, and my job is to help coach and sometimes, help, stare at traces all day, read the code, remediate with them. And so when folks do these rewrites, what I find fascinating about this is that, like, in a lot of cases, I experience product managers or product owners who, in theory, should have a lot of input to these conversations, but in practice have either not had as much as maybe they wanted to, or would delegate, product quality to I hope I don't misrepresent what you were just saying, but like there is some aspect of chance when the engineer leads, right? If the engineer understands the problem domain and is the user, maybe they have a firmer understanding of what makes a good versus bad experience. But in a lot of domains, the engineer is not the user, right?
Yeah. And this is why dev tools are moving as fast as they are right now, and everything else isn't.
Interesting.
Because the developers are the users, so they understand what the user needs. The PM can be overrated and it goes well, but at every other company that's developer-driven, but the users aren't developers, you're just kind of running in circles all the time.
So I experience, I think some people will look at what I say on Twitter and think, why do you hate developers? And my answer is I don't. I think we have a management crisis in Silicon Valley.
I'll say it for him. I hate developers.
I'm a developer, man.
Same.
Lay off. So I'm trying to get to the bottom of this management failure. Like a lot of the work that I'm doing now, a lot of the if you'll see my blog, the very long posts, that kind of thing, are about why are we in such a state where we have allowed developer enthusiasm to replace product ownership? To maybe repurpose some of your language.
I love the way you framed that. I actually almost brought this up earlier, but didn't feel like the right topic at the time. Something I've seen a lot of now is like a Y Combinator founder that talks to a lot of startups, and both the ones that succeeded are now huge companies like Twitch, Retool, stuff like that. Also ones that maybe aren't as successful yet or ever, that have failed outright. And what I've seen is the ability for a technical person to get something from 0 to 1 to even 10 is way higher than a non-technical person's ability to do that. Like, getting started is way easier to like start a company if you know how to build the website, build the app, and get it started in the first place, or at the very least you're willing to learn. And then those people become the leaders of these companies and the ones we look up to, fixate on, the Elon Musks of the world, the Jeff Bezoses of the world, the Zuckerbergs of the world.
So you used to look up to. It's a past tense. Sorry.
A lot of people here probably still do, and a lot of people in my community I know still do. We fixate on the technical founders. Y Combinator does this, we do this. The result is the leaders at the very top often are very technical people, because to get there, they took a technical path, and nobody's taking it away from them once they're there. There's a lot of companies that are under leadership that was engineering first, that aren't engineering companies, and probably need to replace those leaders with people who understand the product, the market, the users, and all those other things better than a technical leader at a company that isn't very technical. I see that painfully often, and the result is of those companies, like if the founders were technical and they were really focused on technical achievement, like the history of Twitch to an extent, where Twitch started as Justin TV, where a dude wanted to stream himself 24/7 Truman Show style, so he got 3 of his friends who were very technical to build all the tech for it. He eventually dropped his CEO because he didn't know what he was doing, and Emmett Shear, one of the engineers, moved to make Twitch, and Twitch is succeeding a lot, largely because he was a user of Twitch because he was really into StarCraft. But as Twitch's demographic and focus has shifted, so has his. He's promoting people who impress him technically, not the ones who deliver the product the best. And the result is a culture that's very driven by your technical abilities rather than how well you understand and help the users. It's actually a huge part of why I ended up leaving Twitch, because I cared more about the users than even some of the product managers, because those product managers were promoted under a company that's focus was technical delivery, not understanding of the users. And I think that's kind of the theme now in Silicon Valley, is technical leaders promoting technical people and giving more ownership to people who work like them, think like them, look like them, and those are often engineers.
So this is fascinating. So I'm trying to come up with attacks on the problem, right? Like a series of ways that we could fix what I'm seeing in traces. So again, I live in traces all day long. I'm looking at the sites. I'm pulling apart the minified code and just reading it as a dumb brute force attack on, some specific site slowness. So this is what I do half of my day, and what I'm seeing is regression, right? Like even in these established domains, in these established categories, I'm seeing new sites being redeveloped with worse outcomes, right? They're literally in many cases setting person-sized bales of Benjamins on fire, right? They're just torching money on the promise of, well, we can move faster. And those teams, by the way, by the time I'm in the room, they're stuck. They're not moving at all. They're dead in the water. They can't ship anything. Like anything they do will make the problem worse. And making the problem worse is the one thing that the businesses now said they can't do. So I'd like to find ways to attack this problem. And it seems to me like it's now, because engineers are so, I don't want to say overpowered, but empowered to make choices on behalf of the business. Does that mean that we need to be thinking about ourselves as being more owners, that we have more agency in the overall product health than we somehow imagined that we did, or that we need to find other ways for this community to build empathy with the users who are in those environments that we're not?
Generally, my stance on this is we live in a free market. We should let the market do its thing. If you are a technical person, you probably shouldn't be a product lead. And I've learned this the hard way at Ping. The best thing I've done for our company was step aside, let my wonderful CTO, Mark, take over more of the tech, and learn our users as best I can. Spending more time on YouTube, managing other people's channels, understanding what creators needed to succeed on different platforms. And I realized that in a lot of ways we started the wrong company. We have to rethink a lot of what we're doing now that we better understand our users. And I specifically have taken on the role of deeply understanding the users to my best ability. Do that or find someone who has if you want to start something. And if you're working somewhere where you've noticed like, oh, hey, Google Docs would be a lot better if the people who were making decisions on it understood what people needed in a word processor, go make a new one. You will do much better if you understand your users better. And I think there's a huge opportunity right now for new companies to disrupt the old guard simply by disrupting them with a better understanding of what users need.
I think that's a very deep insight. Should we take a break?
So I believe the thing we wanted to focus on more on this section is how people got into the mess of React and also how you recommend getting out of it to an extent.
Sure, I think it's interesting. So most of the sort of coaching, consulting, whatever you want to call it that I do for a living, tends to focus on teams that, have found themselves in this ditch. And this ditch is deep and it's wide, and these teams intentionally drove into it because someone told them that there were riches and incredible performance on the other side, and they couldn't see the huge pileup that was in the ditch because it's very deep. So when they get there, the question is, oh God, how did we get here? And it's funny because the ditch contains Angular projects and Ember projects and React projects and jQuery projects and all kinds of things. Like you can make a mess with any stack. I think I just want to like back up and sort of like talk about maybe the meta of what I'm seeing, which is when you don't own your stack and your stack owns you, you can make a mess in any stack because performance and good experiences in general are on the other side of mastery. When you have mastered your stack, you can make a good experience in all these dimensions, right? Accessibility, performance, security, privacy, usability, coherence of your design language. When you master your stack, you can make a good experience with pretty much anything. So I've seen incredible teams take React and do extremely impressive work under really tight conditions, right? So I always think about the Flipkart team. Their market's India. No one has an iPhone in India, to a first approximation, right? It's like a 2% market penetration thing for iOS in India.
And it's mostly iPhone 6s to this day.
Yeah, because it's mostly refurb. So the market there is extremely challenging, but the team that built Flipkart.com rebuilt it as a PWA, one of the first PWAs, were of a caliber where they could have built React themselves. They could strip it down, and rebuild it in 2 minutes with their eyes closed. That was kind of the caliber of team that was involved, and so because they were masters of the system, they shipped a pretty great experience on super low-end devices. They did things that nobody else does, even to this day. And that is why they succeeded. They were masters of the complexity. And so what I see now in the ditch are teams that were sold complexity that was not signposted, right? So when I go at the React team, I have a go at the React team not because their system is unusually complex, although in many cases it is, right? Who the hell rebuilds the event system? Or hard codes an HTML element, like names. Like, who does that?
I don't want to go too in depth on.
Who does this? Nobody.
In the web APIs that force the React community to reinvent things, and they got fixed, and they never patched them in after.
That's right. So this is endemic complexity, right? This is basal complexity that you and your team, when you adopt this tool, now own, right? And so let's talk about the guardrails that Facebook puts on that complexity. Like I always tell anyone. Should you use React? If you come to me and ask, should you use React? I'll ask you a series of increasingly specific and less generous questions. Do you have performance targets, right? That is to say, do you have end-to-end guardrail metrics for the actions in your product that you care about? Do you have a staff performance team? Are you behind a login wherein you can preload a bunch of the complexity up front? Do you have an ML system that builds a per user bundle every evening for each individual user so that you get an optimal first load? If the answer is yes to that set of questions, oh, by the way, and you can afford to rebuild it for every single different type of client, desktop, high-end mobile, mid-tier mobile, and low-end mobile, if the answer is yes to that pile of questions, please put it in your matrix of things to consider. If the answer is no to any of those questions and you were hoping to build a single website to serve a lot of users, what are you smoking? Like, this is designed for a world of constraints that you, A, aren't putting on your product, right, in the sense of those metrics, those guardrails, that CI/CD integration, those scorecards that come back from every A/B test that let you know whether or not you regress performance in a way that would be business critical. If you don't have that kind of guardrail infrastructure, and you just think that because Facebook did something, it worked, then you aren't looking at the world very closely, right?
If I worked at a company or ran a company that had the type of money to pay you to ask these questions and get that depth of an answer, we probably shouldn't be using React, or we should do all the things you said before we're using it. But the thing that made React win, that is so different from these other frameworks, that's both the thing that makes React great and the cause of a lot of the problems that we have now, is it is so stupidly simple by design. Like, React is, of like the modern web libraries, the most minimal. It doesn't even have like a getting started template. Create React App isn't even really made or maintained by Facebook. They don't prescribe a way to use React. They just kind of give you the primitive of the component and the hook and the VDOM to reconcile it. That's about it. And the result is React isn't a way to build. React is a piece of what you're building. And because of that, the developers who pick it, because they're picking React, end up just taking whatever comes up in the first blog post for all the decisions from that point forward, and the result is a dumpster fire. They're not picking technologies they understand, and they're not picking a stack that they own. This is a big part of what I'm pushing with like the T3 stack. The goal is, here are the pieces, here are our docs that reference those pieces so you can go better understand them and why you would or wouldn't want to use them. Even the init has you select the things you want, and they're all deselected by default. The goal is to let you own your stack, understand the decisions you're making, and own it as a result. And I wish that was the goal of more educators as well as frameworks.
So let me push back a little bit and say that for years I have asked the React team to publish just what they do at Facebook, right? It's not that they don't use, you know, CSS in JS the way some people out here are doing it because, you know, like they started their website before that. They don't do that because that's a fucking stupid idea. CSS in JS is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard of. From a runtime performance perspective, from what you do in the browser, if it actually compiles out to a different CSS file, game on. If you're talking about manipulating rules in the document at runtime, or adding objects into strings, serializing those strings into classes, sending them to the CSS engine to be parsed back into a data structure to then reapply, potentially with global effects, the hell are you doing, right?
That one's kind of nice.
The React team doesn't do this because it's dumb, right? There's a whole series of things that they don't do because at scale, they're really not going to help you. They can go so far as to be classed as anti-patterns. And so they don't do them at Facebook, right? But they don't tell you that they don't do them at Facebook or any of the other amounts of extraordinary control, testing, and management that goes along with buying a pile of complexity this large. And so there is a sin of omission sitting here, right? I think you put the best construction on it, which is to say, oh, it's just this little thing that you can plug into other stuff. That's a nice story, but after I've asked them for many years to help steer their community clear of the ditch, and they refuse to do so, this is not a victimless crime. This is not a problem that is theoretical. This is teams I sit with that I'm helping remediate these issues every day. The React team ain't doing that, right? In the same way that if this was Angular, and by the way, hold on, let's stop this. If you're selling a pile of complexity this large, you need to disclaim the limits of it, right? God love Mishko. I had a conversation with him not that long ago where he and I used to butt heads inside of Google because, you know, they would say, well, why aren't you talking about our thing? Our thing is fast. And I'd put it on the bench and I'd look at it and I'd be like, is it? And so we would get to a data-driven question, but a question that was hard to answer from their perspective. And so I couldn't, you know, endorse that style of construction because it was going to put too much complexity on users. And now what I see, and I try not to post traces of private sector sites because I don't want to, you know, punch down at teams, but I will post traces of public sector sites. And what I'm seeing a lot of there is regression about critical public services, things that people in need to get the stuff that they're owed by their government. And as a culture, as a front-end community, we are failing many of those users because we have chosen our preference about piles of complexity that we barely understand, let alone manage, versus serving those users well. And so I'm seeing Angular and React disasters proliferate about public service sites that are being redeveloped, right, in the new style. So we came here today with a question about whether or not SPAs are appropriate. And I'd like to reframe the question as to be how much complexity is appropriate for each use case, right? Because if we don't talk about the complexity that teams end up owning, how can they possibly begin to manage it? And my experience today, looking at these experiences, is that they aren't, right? And so that is an externality, right? From an economic perspective, the market has failed. There isn't a functional market for this, because if there's a functional market for these services, especially when there's a single provider of a service, right? That complexity turns into an externality that taxes the user, right? I got into front end to serve the user. I'm here to make a user interface for people to benefit from the service that we run. I'm not here to scratch my own itch in a professional sense, right? And as a product owner, you're here to like maximize the success of your product. I think there's this really underappreciated part of this conversation, which is also hysteresis, and I won't bang on too much more. I apologize for going on for so long. But hysteresis is the blindness that occurs when something is so slow that a user bounces off of the service. Right, like we had this classic example at Google where the search team went and they cut a bunch of JavaScript out and they made a bunch of other optimizations to improve latency, and their numbers tanked. Why did the numbers tank? Why did they get slower at the P75, P90, P95, and at the tail? Well, there was a tracer, or a marker at the top of the page in the HTML that marked when the user hit that, and then the metric ended at the bottom when the user got to the bottom of the page, and the little script started to run, or that image started being requested. Well, when you made the page faster, people who were already waiting an almost infinite amount of time got further in the process. There were users who were invisible, who were part of that theoretically addressable market, who were invisible to us because we were making something so slow that they couldn't be actually in our market. Right? So when we make things that are so built for the privilege bubble that we can't understand how deep into it we are, we exclude users by default. Right? When digital is the default way that we make services, slowness is exclusionary. And that's the reality that our community is, I think, slow to catch on to.
There's a lot in here I agree with and a lot in here I disagree with. I really like the public sector piece because both one of your tweets a while back about a COVID website that was built in React was really interesting to me. And also, I honestly think that public sector has a really good opportunity here to enforce expectations of government mandated suggestions on how to build your website as a public service and goals to hit, and to a team that is a public service team that helps you hit these goals and achieve these things. We are very far from that. One of the few cool things I saw is the government open sourced a font recently, which was cool. It has a whole GitHub profile, people who really know what they're doing in it, and some really interesting comments in there, GitHub issues and such. But there just isn't a push there from people who get it and care about it. And a lot of the employees who are working on public sector stuff are not engineers who understand the web, much less the intricacies of JavaScript in performance.
I'd like to push back on this a little bit. A lot of the folks I've worked with in the public sector are extremely talented, thoughtful, and they want to do a great job. A lot of the disasters come from consultants who parachute in. Private sector folks who don't have the public sector ethos. If you'd like to understand how to build a digital service well, the Government Digital Service in the UK has published something called their design manual, their design service manual. And the GDS design service manual is one of the best things that you could go read as someone who's building a product or a front end, because it steers, certainly UK government teams, away from this ditch. And it does it basically by saying, JavaScript is special occasion food, right? You can have some as a treat, right? Because from a user's perspective, that's what JavaScript should be. It is the most expensive resource that you can pull into a page, kilobyte for kilobyte, right? Images get decoded off main thread. We do freaking magic about images. CSS gets resolved independently. But the amount of weight that you can add per kilobyte of JavaScript is unbounded, right? That's the Turing tar pit for you. So I feel you, but I got to tell you, we have a market failure here. Folks are burning money, and one of the things that we can't talk about as a culture and as a community is how badly teams are getting fucked by the current state of the art. Teams get beached all the time. Sometimes they get fired because the results are so bad, but we don't talk about it. Instead, we go on stage at the next conference and pretend like it's all going well.
Do you really think that there are a lot of these teams where there are talented engineers that know how to deliver better, and they are
Absolutely.
blocked
I have seen them get. I have seen that. So what often happens is that those same folks who actually understand how to deliver a good service will get pushed out by the fad. So what will happen is some new manager, some new VP gets hired in, and they say, "Oh, we're going to rebuild it on X because X is cool. I wrote a thing with it over the weekend, and it was really great on my laptop." I see Ryan laughing because. I'm not talking about your team, by the way. I'm talking about several others that I've worked with. Where this new manager comes in and they encounter some resistance from the old guard, the people who just don't get it, who don't want to build things in the modern way. And those users are preventing the entire organization from lighting money on fire. And I'm not talking about public sector stuff. I'm talking about like businesses, digital businesses with money that is really at stake. Those teams will have this powerful person come in. They'll flush the top level of management who look like they're not going to play ball. They'll get down to the people who will. Those people will be enthusiastic because they get to go to the cool conference and give a talk about the thing that isn't working. But they will never say that it isn't working. And in fact, in a lot of cases, those same managers, when they launch the big new rewrite, the inevitable React rewrite, the inevitable solo album, the React solo album, when that thing comes out, it'll tank metrics. Right? In a lot of cases, they won't tell their teams. Because if you tell the team, hey, the thing you just labored on for 6 or 8 or 12 or 18 months is losing the business a huge amount of money, oh boy, does that hurt? So by the way, that's when I get called in a lot of these cases. And no one pays me except for my employer, by the way. You don't spend money with me to get me to like tell you the bad news. Who would pay for that? For one.
You'd be surprised. I've gotten some DMs from some companies in really bad spots that are like, hey, can you give us like a code base audit? Like, what's your rate? But
yeah. So when folks get into this spot, right, in many cases, the teams themselves won't know. Right, they will be insulated from some of these choices by the privilege of being the enthusiastic engineer whom all hopes are pinned and no responsibility is placed. So this is where I think I come back to this question of, do we need to have a more professional culture in front end that puts users first?
I try to find the right way to say no to this, because this is a really good framing to a thing I really disagree on. I think that the problem I've seen more of is people who aren't seasoned enough as web developers can get too far using React. I myself was guilty of that. I was doing web dev back in like the OG WordPress days, and I hated it so much that I refused to do anything related to the web and became a backend developer for the majority of my career, actually, at Twitch. The point where I'm still known as a backend developer, even though I helped rewrite the site in React. The thing React gave me was a pleasant and exciting enough developer experience that I was hyped to learn more about the web and build more things for it. I think the state of like education materials and the digestibility of something as simple as React is uniquely powerful in the people it's empowered to build and deliver software. I know the way I kind of think of it is like there's a two-dimensional grid of how much time have you put in, and there's like and how capable are you. There's a line that's you know the web and the web browser standards really well. Someone like you is way over it. Someone like me is hopefully near that line eventually. But React lets you deliver something before you even know that web standards are a thing. Does that hurt in a lot of places? Absolutely. Does that empower developers like me who might not know web standards enough to make terrible decisions and footgun us long term? Absolutely. Does it let us get to product market fit faster with those things in a lot of cases and allow us to deliver software and build things that we might not have been able to build before? 100%. The magic of React is by being so minimal, but its patterns being so accessible. It allows me as a developer to apply it to lots of different things. I can do a dumb mobile app that lets me play music. I can do a website that lets me do Zoom-like calls. I can build Twitch with it. And every time I did one of those things, the architectures were fundamentally different. They shared the 80 kilobytes or however much of the React code, but everything else was entirely different. It got me excited to start thinking about and building my stacks and helped me become a greater owner in the technologies I was building with. than previous solutions allowed. And my concern with like the earlier suggestion of Facebook should put out prescriptive, here's how you use React, is that it would prevent the levels of innovation that we've seen.
I don't even think that they should tell you how to use React, although I think they should signpost where the lines are for them. They should tell you what it takes for them to use React, right? They should tell you that their mobile launch had to be launched on Inferno because when they launched it on React, it was too slow. They should tell you that they actually have to staff multiple different mobile sites because the React version is still too slow, right? They should be willing to level with y'all.
That's our job.
It's not your job to have inside knowledge of how Facebook works. Why am I here telling you that if it's your job?
I think it's our role as advocates of the web and users in creating good experiences to draw these lines. There are very few creators of things that can correctly draw the lines for them. Even like, God bless Misko, he was convinced Quick is for everything, and I've had to sit him down multiple times and explain, no, you need to find the person who is hurting the most that Quick helps the most. And I cannot imagine a better world where Meta is regularly updating us on how they use React, especially when we both know how much that flies in the face of how many others use React. I know personally, although a lot of my decisions align with some of the lines that Facebook and Meta draw, they don't fully, and I would probably ignore those posts or maybe read them just for context if they made blog posts about that, because I am a user of React who knows the limitations, knows how it benefits me, and knows how it doesn't. And I am an owner in those decisions. I'm afraid that Facebook taking a stronger public stance on it would be taking a little bit of that ownership away. And I don't see enough reason for it when we're more than capable of doing this thing.
So can I uncharitably characterize or summarize what you just said
as the hell out of me.
as saying Facebook shouldn't give you more information upon which to make decisions because your information, which doesn't have that information, is better than their information?
Their information might not be applicable to me, and anytime the creator of a thing shares a thing, it is assumed that's the only way to use it. It's the opposite extreme.
I see. So the argument is that they would put such a thumb on the scale of doing a better job for their users that it would scare people off from using React?
Absolutely. This is what happened with Angular.
Isn't that good? So we just talked about earlier that there's a whole swath of experiences.
If you want there to be less new developers that are enjoying themselves earlier in their career, absolutely. We should kill React right now. But as a method for developers to move from backend, move from a cooking job, and all these other things.
Okay, we're to the meat of it. We're finally to the meat of it. So why is React sacrosanct here? Why is Preact not good enough? Right, if we're going to take that numerator over denominator session depth weighted amortized cost for interactions,
isn't there? So
right?
simple.
So if I take Preact and I swap it in, the ecosystem isn't there because it's compatible? This is a weird argument. Is that where does that?
It's not compatible enough. I run into all sorts of weird problems with the many libraries I use where like their implementation of hooks is first off an additional like giant payload on top of like the Preact payload, and it's
sorry, giant being even with that added, still less than a fifth the size of React. Just want to signpost that.
But okay. Like as you add more and more of these things to make it fully compatible and start having to like build your own binding layers, so it's like I've done Preact rewrites. It's a thing that's fun for me to see what I can fit into Preact, even what I can fit into Solid, stuff like that.
But if the argument is that we're going to move the community to a different place, wouldn't a lot of that investment come along?
It could, but it would take a long time to get there, and there isn't enough incentive to do it. Even then, we're seeing stuff like this.
So the argument is that we shouldn't add incentive to do it because there isn't enough incentive to do it?
I feel like we're going in loops, but I don't know what we're looping around.
I agree. We're going in loops. But the argument seems to be, and help me if I'm misunderstanding, but the argument that I'm taking from this is that we shouldn't dissuade people who shouldn't be using React to not use React because then people wouldn't use React and then it would be bad.
Facebook shouldn't be dissuading people from using their thing, and it's a weird burden to put on them to be the top level person telling you how to not use their thing and to not use them.
I'm only advocating that they tell you how they use it. I'm not asking them to make prescriptive guidance.
That'd be nice, but I don't think that solves the problem that we're trying to solve here, which is people using React incorrectly.
What are you afraid of?
I am afraid of new developers giving up earlier because the tools that you're telling them to use instead are harder to learn with.
So I just want to put a pin in this because we've already signposted that React is a little thing It's not the whole system, right? It's not your data system. It's not your transport layer. It's not your storage system. It's just a little piece of this. It's not your build tool, right? All those things are things that you wrap around this very small contract, right? And so this very small contract is, we agree, is a powerful abstraction. But I could get that same powerful abstraction and wrap other things around it from many of the web components libraries that are out there. I could get it from Solid. I could get it from Preact, right? Just like I could get it from Vue. There's just dozens of alternatives right now. And so what's the 5-line, 10-paragraph version of why we shouldn't be planning a migration away from React to something that is going to fail less often?
Oh, we absolutely should. It's a matter of how much less often will it fail and how long will it take for us to get there, in particular with the ecosystem and the learning materials. If I could snap my fingers and have the beta React docs rewritten with Solid.js, I would recommend that as a starting point for new developers. But we can't. There has been millions of dollars spent on creating incredible education materials and tools, both open source and private, that allow us as React developers to learn faster, deliver faster, and have more ownership of what we're building than we ever could before. This can happen in other ecosystems with better core pieces. React isn't special in that it's the only thing that could ever do this, but it is special in that it's the first thing on the web to really deliver that promise of, here are some primitives, go build whatever the hell you want with it.
I'm going to push back a little bit and say that HTML did that, but
okay, fair.
I mean, no, but very seriously, like this is literally what HTML does, right? You get to view source, take some HTML, put it in an editor, hit Control-R on your own website, and then suddenly you have the roughly the same bones of the same thing. Maybe then you have to go figure out what the styling was, right? In the same way that
and web components are the exact opposite of that.
So web components are meant to help you do the progressive enhancement of pieces of that tree. Right? That is to say, instead of inventing a new tree in the Turing tar pit that omits some HTML sometimes, it lets you integrate your components into the tree that the browser already has built and managed. So it is not itself a top-down, data-bound reactive system, but it allows you to add one should you like to do it at much lower incremental and total cost.
Yeah, but that piece will not work at all until the JavaScript has loaded.
You can style it with the not defined styles. Look, I'm not going to get into the React community's general ignorance of what the web can do today. We'd be here all night. But it's a deep well. Browsers have gotten a lot better since 2012, 2013, when React was designed around the limits of IE7 and IE8. Right? We're in a place now where we do have the opportunity, I think, as you said earlier, to disrupt by exploiting a bunch of new holes that have been opened up since then.
Yeah, and something that I've always been frustrated by, and especially now that I'm like on the CEO side, is people who spend all day complaining about the way things are and not enough time taking advantage of the opportunity that things being bad represents. Like, if there are so many of these big companies that are unable to ship for months, if not years, because the tech they picked is bad and the resulting experience is worse, that is a massive opportunity for new people to disrupt and challenge those stagnant companies and win. And I would love to see more like people who refuse to use React because they know better in many cases, which they absolutely do, and you shouldn't, to use that unique knowledge and insight you have, combine it with an understanding of users that aren't being served as a result of technical decisions, technical leadership, and all of these things that remove you from that layer, put layers between you and the problem you're trying to solve. Those are opportunities. The more of those layers you can remove, the better. But I don't find React is often enough, and you even said this before, or when we were talking earlier, you don't often recommend moving off of React. You recommend best practices and patterns and ways for the teams to level themselves up to better deliver good experiences.
Yeah, that's right. So going back to that model of sort of managing complexity or having the complexity manage you, right? The complexity that you lay down in your stack is additive. It is accretive. It does come to, in each increment, turn out to be something that you own. It is something that you have to pay a tax for, an ongoing installment tax for, not just in terms of payload on the wire, not just in terms of the complexity for upgrading to the next version, which can often be a breaking thing, but in terms of the management discipline that you have to add on top of it in order to make sure that it doesn't go off the rails. And so I don't, when I sit down and consult with teams, suggest very often that they do a rewrite. Sometimes things are so bad. In the extreme case, things are so bad that, yeah, maybe you need to flush the team and do a rewrite. That's extremely rare. Almost all the time.
But you usually push for a whole team reset as well with that.
No, most people are when they have new goals are going to respond to new goals and say those goals are more important than my priors, right? Like if we put the user first and say that the goal is to serve the user first, then we can find a way to do that in almost any stack. And so most of the time we can mitigate the badness in an endemic stack in a product by saying, okay, what are the critical user journeys? Do we have those under test? Like, are those on the bench? Are those under web page test? Or do I have them in CI/CD? Can I know whether or not I'm regressing them? Can we set a performance budget? Can we start to manage this thing down, right? Can we start to put a team of people who are excited about taking on this new direction to go start to rip things out? But most of the errors, it almost like you can make a mess in any stack. I've seen web components disasters, right? Absolute disasters. And the remediation process is the same there. You figure out what the core user thing is. You put that first. You have someone who's managing to that. You set goals around that. And once you've got some place that you can go have a kind of blameless postmortem style of investigation around what's actually happening here, you don't string people up. You put the trace on screen and you say, aha, the long tempo is here, we need a left shift, right? When we left shift, that means pulling complexity out most of the time. So how do we identify the complexity and then how do we left shift it? How do we take those things like too many connections being set up, fonts being loaded badly, to CSS and JS? How do we evict pieces? Don't get me started.
I would love to get you started on that one in the future.
If you've made the Apollo mistake, it's not too late.
You can come back from it, we promise.
Okay, I'll leave it there. But in your goal to left shift, right, the goal isn't to simply do a one-off fix for whatever endemic complexity that happened to be hurting the user experience. It's to get the team into the mode of thinking about the user, putting their goals first, specifically the marginal user, because to this market failure problem, a lot of teams don't even know who their user is at the margin, right? Their data will tell them, but they're probably not looking at it. And so then you can figure out, okay, what is my market? You said mobile. I was really interested to hear that there's this whole sort of potential set of users that are, I guess in theory part of your total addressable market, but in practice you're saying no to.
I will gladly go in depth on that.
Okay, so there's a reason you're saying no, but for many teams, for whatever reason, accessibility, performance, features, they may be saying no to users that they would like to say yes to. If you ask the business owner, hey, would you like to say yes to these users? Now, you're the business owner, you're saying no. I respect that.
Not yet. And I think that's a big thing is when you are making decisions about your product, especially at like varying sizes of company, it's important to understand the cost of doing something like making the website work better on mobile devices on 3G. If you're a company that has millions of users and are potentially losing millions more users that could be generating multiple salaries worth of revenue, absolutely you need to be hiring people who are experts in getting on top of that. But a lot of companies aren't there yet, and a lot of companies are trying to figure out if the thing they're building is worth building at all. And React and tools like it help you get to the point where you hit your first 100,000 users faster.
And again, I don't want to take anything away from the exploratory phase, but I just want to say that almost nobody is doing that. Most software projects in the world are funded out of the budgets of existing companies, right? Of companies that understand their market and are building something that is either in the vein of something that has already existed or is a rewrite.
Half agree. I've seen a lot of companies moving towards a more like vertical slices model rather than like Google as a back-end team, a front-end team, an APIs team, a databases team. Rather, like when I was at Twitch, there was very vertical teams. Like I was on the creative, or specifically the creative experiences team when I joined, which had an ML person, a UI person, 2 backends and a front end, and a bunch of partner managers. We realized that was the wrong assembly of that team for the mini startup we were running inside of Twitch, so we reassembled accordingly. We made our own unique tech decisions that were running very much against what the company was doing based on what we in our vertical slice thought was best. We were running Elixir and everybody else was running Rails and eventually moved over to Golang. But we did what was best to get to our users as fast as possible to prove the viability of a sub-market within Twitch.
So just tech question, was that a component that was being loaded into pages that were being composed by some other thing, or was that a separate page?
In our case, we were effectively a mini company that was using Twitch the normal way with the ability to poke and prod and get them to add things for us. Almost all of the product we ended up building for that team was backend that would spit out an RTMP feed to Twitch, and then we would like build within the experience of Twitch as it had been defined by other teams.
Got it. So I bring that up because lots of teams wind up incidentally building things that get composed into other people's experiences. And that's the place where I think we maybe as a discipline have fallen down furthest, right? I think we've lost an entire decade, maybe two, worth of learning about what it means to respect the user at scale, because we have decided that our technology preferences should always be considered in isolation. So one of the most inspiring things I've seen a team do that I've been working with recently was they got themselves into a huge world of hurt, big app. And then it turned out that nobody was building their components that were tested in a sufficiently complex DOM with a sufficiently complex set of CSS around them.
Can I ask if they were using Storybook?
I don't know, but I can tell you that they didn't. Yeah, they were. Some of the components that were getting pulled in were. But I can tell you that nobody who was building any of the added components actually had it in mind that even though they knew they were building for an embedded environment, that the complexity that they were putting onto the whole was going to be part of a whole that had an overall budget of which they needed to be in a tiny fraction. Right.
I had some fun with this at Twitch. I led the tech for a page called ModView, which was a moderator page that pulled in components from 12 different teams, all of which had really dumb decisions around global state, assuming that like they owned the route that they were on, which they didn't in this route anymore, and having to re-architect the way those teams managed state, the way that they had assumptions about the way components interrupted, even dumb stuff like our page was resizable and you could resize individual elements. So teaching other teams how responsivity works in order to make that product viable. And that absolutely sucked. But I don't blame React for that sucking. I blame the company's culture and the goal of delivering software. But I don't really see it as that big of a problem, because when it became a problem, advocates like myself and the other talented developers at Twitch got to step up and take it on. And that challenge was a huge part of how I got seen as a more technical, understanding person who solves those problems. And those opportunities, although it sucks that they keep occurring, they are awesome opportunities for developers to level themselves up and solve those problems for their companies. And you see what happens more than anything when no one stepped up to do it. You are coming into these things when the developers either weren't aware enough or just didn't care enough to do that.
Oh no, I absolutely am familiar with the pattern of companies hiring arsonists as the fire chief. Right, this happens on a loop. The idea that we should have a chief inspector for your sprinklers, who is also, carrying a gasoline can and a lit match, is something that often gets rewarded.
I prefer to call them hot takes.
Sure, it's the hottest, on fire, literally. And this is a pattern that is, I think, if you were a manager, it would behoove you to spot, because what we end up with here is a congratulation for failure. And then instead of treating remediation like a team sport, we treat remediation like something to be celebrated, rather than an ongoing tax on the team. Because what I can tell you happens next and next and next and next is sometimes a team will get themselves into a spot where they fix the one thing. And there's a party, everyone celebrates, maybe there's cake. That'd be good. Cake's good. And then everyone thinks it's out. Everyone thinks it's done. We're back to shipping features. We were stopped. We couldn't ship features for a while, right? We stopped shipping features. We fixed it. All the management attention that was devoted to this fire is out. We can go back to actually delivering. So you deliver for a while, and then, my God, it's on fire. How did this happen? And so you put it out again. And eventually, your promises at a top level, group level set of OKRs to the group above you start slipping. Well, why did that slip? Well, we had this firefight. Well, there's a really gnarly bug, and so-and-so did an incredible job of putting it out, and we're so proud of them. And then the fourth or fifth time the senior manager hears that, they go, did we buy particularly flammable construction materials? And so you start to lose the confidence of senior management when that is the pattern that recurs inside of your organization. And so it is actually super bad for the engineers and the mid-level managers who find themselves in this situation to be constructing their UIs out of arson kits, right? Don't buy Next, it's going to blow up. When you do this, you end up in a situation that hurts your team. And it hurts, this is what kills me. People think that I'm anti-developer or that I'm anti-React. I'm not. I'm here for you and your team. I spend time remediating this stuff with these folks. Don't put yourself in this position. Don't do this to yourself. It sucks so much. If you have the choice of a lower complexity stack overall, especially if you have evidence of short sessions, just pick some HTML and progressively enhance it, right? Add some jQuery, add some web components, right? But do it on the basis of evidence. And if you don't have evidence, take the global baseline as your starting point. Conservative estimates about networks, devices, and CPUs, and work backwards from there. You can afford some JavaScript. You can afford some. Like, I publish global estimates every couple of years. I published one last year. I did an update at a talk a couple weeks ago.
300K or so now, right?
Yeah, you can afford, if you serve it perfectly, over 2 connections or less. You can afford about 150K of HTML and CSS and maybe an additional 300 to 350K of JavaScript if you're building in that style. If you move mostly to HTML and CSS, you can afford a ton of images and all the rest, right? Like you can get up to a megabyte. JavaScript is the most expensive thing by an order of magnitude.
I can do a lot more with 5 kilobytes of JavaScript than 5 kilobytes of image, to be fair.
Sure. Have that within the budget. But you got to remember that the median device was sold 18 months ago. It's a slow Android phone, and it's on a slow LTE connection. The P75 device, the one you really want to be targeting, was sold 30 months ago. It was sold at the average selling price 30 months ago. It's not a rich person's device. The average selling price was $300. $300, phone, new, 30 months ago, new unlocked. That's a 4 to 8 core affair. Its CPUs are clocked at about, 2.4 gigahertz. Thank goodness for some process node improvement there. And we're now to a point where it'll probably have about 4 gigabytes of RAM, maybe 6. So we're in that zone. They will still be slow cores. They'll still be A53 cores. You can buy these things new for about $200. To get in touch with the actual lived experience of your product or your service, especially if it targets the mobile web, you don't have to spend more than $200. You can get it on Amazon. If you spend more than $200, you paid too much for your test device.
I have a whole drawer full of old, crappy Android phones that I use all the time for testing stuff, and I am regularly horrified by how slow things are. That all said, I think it's important to recognize that people buying $80 phones have a limited financial spend year over year as well. And if your goal is to build a business that is making money, it takes a lot of users before a developer is worth the cost to properly target those devices. And if you're now looking for developers who have been around for long enough to have started with jQuery and be familiar with when that is the right or wrong solution, you're already, financially speaking, just in your investment as the company, spending much more to get there. And the last question I want to ask before we go into Q&A is, if I was a new developer, somebody interested in learning development, and React is this arson kit, where would I go to start, both technology-wise, but also education material-wise? How would I, as a new developer, start on a better path?
So there's some really great, web components, zero to hero kind of things where if you want to understand, let's say you're brand new, right? And you actually aren't making something. You aren't in this sort of, I think, pressurized environment that you're describing where you have to get something out the door and iterate on it quickly. But you're in that learning mode. You've got a little bit more time. You'd like to understand how things work. First, there's a whole series of YouTube posts, YouTube playlists from something called Chromium University. Chromium University is the training that we give Chromium developers, the folks who show up to work on Edge or Chrome or Opera.
From my experience with those, they're much more targeted at existing developers and learning the ways of Chromium. I'm talking for someone who hasn't programmed before. A lot of them start with React, and I think it's a great starting point.
I just want to get to the end of my rant. Sorry. So there's one called Life of a Pixel. I would not expect anyone to understand it all up, not even a web developer to understand it all up. There's a bunch of stuff in there that's C++ level. Gavin will get it, and I don't know who else in the room would. But the pastiche you take away from it is an understanding of the pipeline. And there's some great draw splainers from Mariko Kosaka that outline basically the internals of how browsers work. You don't have to be a programmer really to understand those. They give you the basic building blocks and they describe the phases of the system. And then from there, I would start with some of these CSS tutorials and then advanced HTML tutorials, advanced forms stuff that you can do now, and I would go to some web components, and then I would pick up a framework, because from there, you can understand which problems the framework solves. And until you start from the basis of like, here's what my HTML does, oh my gosh, I can't do this, the power you're describing of like, it opens up this whole new world, it'll still be there. That power will still be available to you. But you can then pick up a framework and go, oh, I like this about it, I don't like that about it. You don't get trapped in the high complexity tower from which you are afraid to fall.
Should you be able to watch Life of a Pixel and not feel like a really stupid imposter that doesn't belong?
No, I feel like a
before
stupid
you start writing
imposter.
the code?
I feel like a stupid imposter watching Life of a
Do you know
Pixel.
how hard that is on new developers specifically, feeling like an imposter all the time, and how a lot of the things you recommend and the takes you have encourage that feeling for longer?
I am not familiar with evidence that it would encourage that to happen
As a
longer.
person who spends a lot of their time creating content for developers I try to focus myself on senior developers, but I see a lot of people who are more junior developers showing up in my community. The ones who have learned the fastest and most effectively and gotten through that imposter syndrome bout the fastest and most effectively, 10 out of 10 of them are React developers.
So let me just say that I am not over my imposter syndrome, so I don't know how anyone else does it. I wish them the best of luck, and I congratulate them on their achievement. I expect to not understand the systems above me and below me. Maybe this is a genuine disagreement, but I don't believe that a developer is actually particularly accomplished if they don't have some yawning anxiety about the levels above and below that they don't understand.
Yeah,
right?
but they should be able to see something work before they are overcome by that anxiety.
1,000%, and that's why I say start with
Telling
HTML
them
and
to watch Life
CSS.
of a Pixel before they write their first line of code is not helping them get over that anxiety.
Okay, acknowledged, but I would say start with HTML and CSS, start with a text editor, Control R, and then adopt technology as it's solving a problem for you in front of you.
That much I can agree with. Cool. Time for some Q&A.
Give it up.
Okay, so we only got 2 mics, so if you have a question, please come down this way, make your way up here, and I will hand you the mic, and you can ask your questions. But first, I just wanted to thank our speakers. Alex, thank you so much for doing this. It's really great to get a little bit of nuance. I don't think we got as much as I'd like. Maybe a couple more hours of this. Maybe we can do this over Zoom or something again. But it's just an honor to have you here, and I just want to give him another round of applause. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And then this.
Sitting next to me is no easy feat, to be clear. Like having down to like the hot take guy who's the big like React creator now, and having a conversation like this is absurd. And I appreciate you a ton, Alex, for being down to do this. When Ben first suggested it to me, I was like, there's no way Alex is ever going to say yes to this, but sure, if you really want, I'll open the group DM. And you were super down immediately, and I do genuinely appreciate that a lot. So can we get one more big shout out for Alex for being down to have a convo like this? Thank you.
But then obviously having someone who is as outspoken as about React as he is, but also as accomplished as he is, having someone sit across from the table, that's a big challenge, right? That takes a lot of courage. And I couldn't think of anyone other than Theo, given the personality he has and the experience he has. So let's give it up for Theo for taking up this mantle. And it looks like we have a number of questions, so I will welcome our first Q&A or Hey.
Hey, I'm Aditya. I just want to say thank you for organizing and super great perspective. I totally see both sides. Wasn't really clear on the last decade, but now I'm getting it, like what we're all missing out on because we just rely so heavily on React. I wanted to ask you guys, what do you think about Astro and how it fits into this whole paradigm, because it hydrates pretty quick?
I'm a real big Astro fan. In fact, Create T3 app, which is a boilerplate around Next.js, for our docs, we actually chose to use Astro because the docs are a static site that doesn't need interactivity, and using something that's JavaScript first made no sense at all. I think that Astro is allowing, the thing I first said about Astro when I first started using it was the first static and HTML first framework I used that felt like it understood the developer experience wins we had seen over the last decade in tools like React. It's the first time I felt like I could move as fast building a static site as I could building something more dynamic in React land. And a lot of the paradigms, the reusability, the ability to write server code right above that fetches stuff PHP style. It felt like PHP, but with the wins that we've had over the last decade in tooling. I personally love it. I hope that it becomes a better starting point both for developers learning for the first time and also for new projects, seeing how long they can make it on Astro before you're like, ugh, having a virtual DOM at the root with React would allow us to update our pages better, and the amount of time it takes for the HTML to come down the wire when you click a link's a little annoying for our more interactive sites. So I have definitely seen Astro not perform great in certain things, and I know that Fred K. Scott, the creator of Astro, a good friend of mine, whenever I bring him on my show, the first thing he says is, do not rewrite ping in Astro. Oh, that's helpful. Do you have comments as well?
I'm a fan.
For those on the recording, Alex says he's a fan. Next up.
Hello. So I'm one of the co-authors of the GitHub CLI. So we took github.com, big website, lots of JavaScript, and we put it in the command line.
I'm going to shout it out harder because he won't. The GitHub CLI is one of the biggest DX wins I have had. The fact that I can, in like 3 characters, push up a PR it has changed how often I break up my work into pieces that are individual PRs instead of one giant one. So you have made my CTO's life much easier. Thank you on his behalf.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, what we learned in the first, like maybe within 6 months of doing that, is that both internally and externally, the GitHub CLI was seen as the kind of the standard of accessibility, as well as the standard of using GitHub on really bad internet or on really bad computers. We heard that, from a lot of users around the world. And it really put in perspective for me, like, we're not just writing this kind of supplement to the website. We are replacing the website for people for whom heavy, big, heavy front-end apps just aren't useful. Which leads to my question, which is, what do you think the role is moving forward for user-centric design of the client downloaded desktop application? And I don't mean Electron. So I'm talking about things like CLI tools more for developers, or things like, my favorite example is like OBS, something that's written in like, I assume Qt, I don't know. But yeah, whatever, like, what do you think that role could be in relieving some of the pressure that, your average user around the world is having, trying and failing to use the web?
So I don't have any CLI kind of thoughts, although I think that's really interesting in the same way that my friend Dave working with text messages instead of trying to make the website faster was a very similar way of like reaching users, especially who were at the margins. So I think that's really laudable as a way of thinking alternatively outside of our vein. I have a lot of like things that I've worked on, and so take these with a grain of salt because I've got some pride of authorship attached to them. But when we built service workers, one of the goals there for websites was to ensure that we were able to do a better job about only kind of pulling the diff, right? And one of the things I'm most optimistic about now is the idea of some of the things that I'm starting to see about people doing templating inside their service workers, pulling diffs in a more distributed computing style way, things like YJS, where we can start to have a local data model that syncs with an offline external data model, or replicache. Some of those tools are starting to make it possible for us to think about occasionally connected clients as being first-class citizens. It's going to require us to do a much better job as a community about the integrity and versioning of our data models. We're going to have to start thinking a little bit more like app developers, but I welcome that a lot. I think that's going to be, potentially quite important. And there's a role for browsers to play that we're not playing yet to help users better understand how developers are doing about that. So I'm excited about it.
Absolutely agree with all of that. I also think that it's really important for companies like GitHub specifically to be expanding the the targets of users that can use the platform, people who have awful internet connections that are on like terrible old Chromebooks and things like the GitHub CLI enabling that is incredible. What's funny is the GitHub CLI is enabling that because their giant, mostly static app that has turbo links to switch between pages is such an awful dumpster fire on anything other than a really fast gigabit connection that even I, on my gigabit connection, find myself refreshing twice before I actually trust the content of the page. It's actually one of the worst examples of an MPA dumpster fire I've ever seen. And OBS was also an interesting one to bring up because OBS is both hardware target for it to be a decent experience, as well as the like network requirements to actually use it as like a broadcasting tool are very high. A thing I haven't seen much of and would love to see more of is people targeting native and native-esque experiences to do what you're doing with GitHub CLI and expanding the percentage of users who can use your service. I think Starbucks has a great example of this to further shout out Alex's work with progressive web apps, how those have allowed for people with worse data connections, worse devices to have access to things they might not have otherwise. Where native overall fits in the accessibility of web technologies is an open question that I don't have an answer to beyond it's nice to see it's happening, but I think it's even more expensive. It's a more expensive solution to a expensive problem.
Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you. First of all, thanks, guys. That was really interesting. My question's similar to the first person. I was just curious your general thoughts on Svelte. Like, I might have missed the first part if you guys talked about that already. But.
So my take on Svelte is that, I look at the React ecosystem, or I look at the Angular, React specifically with JSX, but like the Angular ecosystem, a lot of these tools basically require a compiler. There might be someone who will still tell you that you can use React, the APIs, without the compiler. They're obviously full of shit. And what that means at the limit is that you have taken syntactic control over the source. Right, you've asserted this, and there's actually now a spec from the React team, which I'm grateful for them for actually writing about how it extends ECMAScript. But once you require a compiler, we can start to ask a differentiable question. Are you doing a good or a bad job with your compiler? One of the things I really love about Svelte, and I think their community actually is in the right spot in terms of thinking about these trade-offs about performance. They've done a much better job about setting their expectations in the same way that the Preact community has done a better job of setting expectations, or the Lit community, or the Fast community, or a lot of these other sort of, other tools, 11D, Astro, where they signal that performance matters a lot. What the Svelte team has done is they've taken control over syntax in order to return better results, right? They didn't do it in order to deliver just developer experience, although they did that too. They made a reactive primitive inside the language, and they used that to reduce the cost of delivering reactivity. That is lining things up and then executing. What React has done is to line up a series of abstractions and then make you pay for them all the time at the highest possible cost, right? So like if you look at the way Lit or Solid or any of these other systems that have reactive primitives do it, at runtime, they're not building an entirely parallel DOM. Why would you do that? That's super expensive. It's going to add GC pressure. I see these crazy big GCs in the traces I look at because React doesn't know how not to allocate a huge amount of memory in order to do what is effectively a relatively simple operation. And so the quality of the compiler matters a lot. And I applaud the Svelte team for taking the initiative to say, by the time that we are willing to go require a compiler, we might as well do a good job.
Oliver Cheris, he gives some of my favorite talks in the web dev world. I owe him for my own leveling up as a developer significantly. That said, Svelte is Angular, Solid is React. I like React more than Angular. You can infer further from there.
Thanks for the question.
All right, I'm going to give probably a very novice question, but I'd ask, so earlier you explained for a new developer, they would go into more HTML, then go into web components and jQuery. What would be the sort of advice for a sort of junior going into mid-level/senior developer? How far do these technologies scale up? Thank you.
That's a great question, and I think I would start at this question of session depth again. What is the user doing in the session, and what do you want to deliver? Because in the same way that a better engineer is someone who can see the layers above and below them, and see more layers above and below them, I think a more experienced developer in a single layer is going to be able to be trying to make more appropriate trade-offs between where to do work. Do it on the client, do it on the server, and so I would be trying to explore more ways of doing the same thing between client-side approaches, cached client-side approaches, differential approaches, server-side only approaches, and trying to explore that space so that you can have a larger repertoire of how to imagine the same interaction, and the latency trade-offs, the client-side CPU trade-offs, the bandwidth trade-offs, because those are the trade-offs that I think you want a senior engineer to be starting to make. And then the thing I would add to that is a truly senior engineer is going to start coaching others, and so their understanding of the platform below them and the layers above them are the things that are going to, again, in that sort of like expanding repertoire of knowledge, be extremely important. So I would be intentionally go read Ilya Grigoryk's High Performance Browser Networking. Go start to immerse yourself in, what do the performance tools do? What do the tracing tools do? What do the accessibility tools do? The tour of dev tools could take years. But I would start expanding your reach into those other panels and really give it a go.
My best attempt at a shorter version, I'm curious if you agree or not, is find harder problems that have people who are more technical than you around solving them, so you can cheat off their notes and be in the mess of trying to solve them yourself. Sure. Cool.
Thanks for the question. Looks like we got a few more.
Hi, thank you both again for having this discussion. It was really interesting perspectives, and I thought it was especially interesting the things that you both seem to agree on, which one of them was that React is not generally the best choice for an e-commerce site, which is the situation that I found myself in a few months into that current role. And I've been a backend developer for years. This is my first time affecting the front end, and my initial reaction upon doing that was this doesn't make any sense. We're not Facebook. I don't know why we're doing this. I'll eventually figure out why. But it's validating and also a little frightening to hear two people with a lot of expertise agreeing with me on that. And so now I'm just wondering, what does someone do, given that I'm not going to hire a performance team as an IC. I'm not going to champion a rewrite of the entire site 6 months in. So maybe it's hiring Alex.
Again, if I show up at your door or in your team, it's for free. You don't have to hire me. The missing link in so many of these conversations is empathy for the user, right? I think the JavaScript community has adopted a cult of toxic positivity, where we are willing to talk only about the positive things in our own domain and furiously externalize discussions of everything else that may not be going wrong, or going right. And so one of the places where we can start to build empathy for the user is to live like the user. And so the first thing that I'll do in a lot of these conversations, is to hand the product leaders a slow device, or show them, right? Just put it under webpagetest.org, create a video. I can show you how to do this later. Show the comparison, the A/B, get the animal spirits going between your site and your closest competitor's site. If you've seen the speed curve industry benchmarks, those are really great. They sort of run these same tests every week, and you can go compare it, test. The Treo.sh sort of summaries, the core vitals data can also be, really motivating. So what you want to do is motivate change, and you motivate change by helping people understand the consequences of the choices. And so you have to start with, what does this mean in the lives of the user? And sometimes you can't get the organization to actually care. Now, it will, if it's an e-commerce site, be money. Going faster is money. And I have not seen an e-commerce site where taking a kilobyte of JavaScript out does not pay for itself in engineering time, more than a little bit. I was talking with an acquaintance, and they were saying that they found out that removing from their e-commerce site a kilobyte of JavaScript was worth $750,000 a year. 1 kilobyte per kilobyte. So it should be possible. But we have to motivate it with narrative. We have to motivate it with empathy for the end user. And so hand your managers cheap devices. buy cheap tester devices for your team. I can recommend some, and then try to, tell the narrative about how you can better serve those users.
Man, it would be nice to be doing 750K a year of business right now. If you can shave off 1 kilobyte and do that, cool. But the majority of the e-commerce sites I'm seeing are people who are building their own e-commerce site to like sell their merch and shit. And like shaving 3/4 of the JavaScript off that's gonna maybe add 1 shirt sale. So it depends a lot on a lot of those things and being realistic about your business, your customers, and who they are and what they expect is super important. I really like the idea of like the cheap Android phone thing, something I've done before when I was under, like even at a startup that was specifically trying to target target users. I bought a cheap Android phone and sent it to my CEO and said, use the app on this and tell me what we're doing is acceptable and I will shut up. And what I meant by shut up is I will quit. And that's what I ended up doing ultimately because he was like, oh, this is fine. So yeah, like give people those experiences, be the advocate, and one of 2 things will happen. They'll agree and change will happen, or they won't, and you have a great story for your next interview.
Very interesting question. Thank you so much. Next.
Hi, kind of similar to what you were talking about with what you wish you saw the React team publishing. For folks who either provide frameworks, tooling, or platforms for building web applications, is there anything general or specific you wish you saw them creating?
Thanks for the insightful question. Yes. So again, I've been putting out these sort of like baseline metrics for how you can think about the universe. And some of that stuff is actually now built into DevTools. You'll see those set as the defaults for the DevTools or on webpagetest.org. Those defaults are informed by that research. And so it's possible for you to sort of highlight how much of the budget that you would expect the median or P75 user to have, P75 preferably, will be taken by your tool. You can just frame it in terms of budget. If your budget is X, we only take this much, right? Like, and then you're talking about a comparable number. And so I think that could be a powerful marketing tool. I would hope it would be. And beyond that, there's a lot of lighthouse posturing. People going, oh, I got 100 in Lighthouse. Okay, so on your really fast device, you got, okay, with no network. Okay, all right. I think it's really important for us to start situating those numbers. It's never been easier to gather traces. And then, where you can tell developers ambiently in your tool, hey, you're breaching some sort of, good faith limit. If you'd like to, raise that limit, here's the configuration file to do it in. But make it easy for users to find out when they're going to be on the wrong side of this. I have huge personal regret, and this is on me, that I was not able to convince, for instance, the Chrome and Edge DevTools teams until hopefully soon, to start signposting some of this stuff. Your DOM's too big. There's too much CSS. You're pulling in way too much JavaScript. This is going to hurt. Give developers a sense for when it's going to hurt and help them develop that same understanding of where the lines probably are.
Have you used the Next.js CLI much, like in developing of Next apps?
I mostly inherit projects, but I've used the CLI here and there.
Much easier. You know that it highlights in like big red text with errors as soon as you break your thresholds that you wrote for JavaScript loads. Is this not them doing what you're asking?
This is them doing exactly what I'm asking. I think it's great. I think it's tremendous.
No one else is doing that in the industry.
Webpack will output warnings for the same sizes.
Webpack will also more happily output a shitty web app.
Well, I think they're equally happy to do it.
I've seen many more Webpack tragedies than I have Next.js tragedies, even if just because Next.js abstracts away Webpack, so it's harder for developers to do terrible things with it.
Yeah, I can give you the tour sometime. The TLDR here for me is we don't tell developers when it's going to go poorly, and I think up until Core Web Vitals, we weren't reflecting back to developers when it did go poorly. I think there's a lot more to do. And by the way, to someone's earlier point, performance is not always the measure of the thing, right? The product has to be good, its usability has to be good, its accessibility has to be good, its security has to be decent, it has to be reasonable on privacy, right? It has to be user-centered. Like, it's just one aspect of the commons of things that make up your UX, and so I wouldn't over-index on it too much, I think, to maybe your point, but it can be the margin. So if you're talking about something that's going to be mixed into other things or be part of a whole, then I think we do have an extra responsibility to help users understand or signpost where you'll be on the wrong side of it. Now, I don't think that it's a panacea, but it's certainly better than where the industry is today.
Yeah.
What are the better ideas that you have? Like, I think this is also a place where we need new ideas. Like, I'm out. Like, I'm out of ideas. So let's try yours.
My first idea is stop complaining about zero.js frameworks if you're a too much JS framework.
Strong +1.
Hey, so if I could compress the debate that you guys had earlier, it seemed like Theo's position was that in terms of difficulty, React was the easiest pathway for a developer to own a large portion of the web experience, starting from an empty slate. And it seems that Alex's position was that the difficulty he was concerned about is how hard it was to unfuck an experience that was already built in React when performance becomes a business priority. So it seemed that Alex's recommendation is to go back to the fundamentals of HTML, CSS, and there was some mention of web components. But the thing is, where I'm sitting is that I kind of feel that React sits one level above HTML, CSS. It doesn't just say you have HTML, CSS. It says, well, what do you do with it now? How do you organize the HTML, CSS and in a way that relates to state and in coordinating state with a team even, so that you end up with a website experience and not merely something that is a simple static blog. So like if you had to say like one tool or one pathway that is as easy as React, what would it be?
Wanted to quickly say that React doesn't actually have a way to use HTML or CSS. React DOM kind of does, but React itself just spits out a virtual DOM of components with a state management layer that lets you update them. What comes out the other side is kind of up to you as a developer. We've seen this with things like React 3 Fiber for building 3D experiences with React, or React Native, or there have been lots of fun experiments recently with different things you can render React to that aren't HTML, CSS, which is, again, like one of the things I love about React. You can kind of do whatever the hell you want with it. That said, I really love this question, so.
So let's step back. What does React actually do? Like, React is a tree, a retained mode tree of components with reactive updates to state, right? You can have that in a dozen flavors today. You can have that from lit. You can have that from Svelte. You can have that from Vue. You can have that from Stencil. You can have that from Fast. You can have that from just like, it just goes on and on and on and on and on. You can have that same core thing that you're talking about in a dozen different slightly flavored packages. So my answer would be pick one that has lower structural costs, right? But only pick one of these things that's going to do this work on the client side when you have to maintain a local data model, which is to say, not most of the time. For most sessions, most of the time, the session depth won't justify it. So you're going to be using static HTML for a product marketing landing page, and you're going to do some CSS dancing, and maybe you get to something that's like more like a not quite a configurator, but you're going to be doing something that's like, you know, part of a larger flow. In that case, you probably just want some progressive enhancement because the data model is going to live on the server the whole time. The set of use cases where you're going to have a fully local data model that you're going to be performing synchronization on, that's the argument space here. That's the only place that we're arguing over. Everything else should be sending HTML and maybe upgrading it with a little bit of JavaScript. And so in this specific category, pick a bunch. But generally, for most classes of experiences, don't pick any of them.
Thank you.
All right, looks like we got one more. Anyone else?
Thank you so much for being here with everything. So let's touch on the future, if you could, because you mentioned HTML components. They don't play well with React from my experience, and very hard to find resources out there that show you how to do that. But let's step even further because the internet's changing. We've gone to low code, no code in a lot of different places. WebGL is taking off, pixel streaming, live streaming of content. So I have no opinion on it. I want to hear more of your opinions on it.
So yeah, for a little bit of context, for the last, I guess, 5 years, I've been involved in. While I was at Google, I led and was the Uber TL for something called Project Fugu, where we did things like web codecs, web HID, web serial, web Bluetooth, web USB, web transport, where we were trying to intentionally expand the set of capabilities available to you on the web, mostly through JavaScript, right? Like I've got some anti-JavaScript club stickers. You're all welcome to one if you want them. But they come from a place of love, right? Like I am here as a maximalist for the web platform. I believe that the web should be how most experiences are delivered to most computers most of the time. And that's why we worked on PWAs, right? So where are we going with this? Well, there's an adjacent possible. There's a set of things that you can do with the web today, and that, when we push it out a little bit, uncovers the next thing that we could do if we only knew how to get there safely. And that safety is kind of usually the thing. And so with WebGL, right, the next thing is WebGPU. And then we're going to get better at unpacking models for AR experiences, because right now you have to pull your own GLTF decoder down the wire with you, which sucks because it often tends to run on the main thread. So we need to do that off thread, and we need to get better about decoding these textures in a way that's not going to continue to peg you. There's a whole set of things depending on your area that are going to all add up. The only reason that I'm here talking to you tonight about performance and this sort of thing about React is that we got stuck in a local minima. Like we got stuck in a trough arguing about component models when that's now the least interesting thing. And so you highlighted that React doesn't play well with web components. That's not true. React doesn't play well with DOM. Like React just doesn't understand how to do DOM good. So what year will React DOM good is, I think, a really interesting question, because it's gonna unlock some important advances for the community where we stop putting all of our eggs in one basket, where we don't have a totalizing view of the entire tree. We can start to replace parts with little bits that are more portable, that are more composable, that don't have such a high tax rate associated with them, so they're not so afraid of composing them together, right? Like one of the downsides of this kind of totalizing worldview of this there is a meta framework that owns the whole kind of root of the page and everything below it, is that we lose composability. So web components will unlock some more composability whenever React pulls into the station with a DOM that is like not fundamentally broken. I've got a lot of hope. Joey at Google has put a bunch of work in. Why it slipped from React 18, I don't know, but it should hopefully land in React 19. You can use the experimental branch now. Every web components library worth its salt, including the FAST team and the Stencil and the Lit folks, all generate React bindings because the squeaky wheel is always getting the grease. So you can actually use those things and compose them together today because, again, React doesn't know how to do HTML correctly. So there are ways that we can get to the future now. And a lot of that starts with thinking about what is the adjacent possible, what is the set of things that you want us to do. So if you've got requests for the browser for powerful capabilities, please come talk to me. We're in the business of expanding what the web can do. Yes, from JavaScript, but we have to get past this place where we're doing a bad job about the classic set of experiences to unlock the next set that users might actually want.
Weird how every question comes back to React not understanding HTML well enough. I would like to present a different view of how we are getting to the future of the web right now. I see 3 different targets that developers are focused on when they try to improve the web. There is the low code, no code, like you described before, of people who don't necessarily know how to code, but want to build things on the web. How can we improve things for them? There is the low code to new code, junior, mid-level focus of how do we make people who might not understand the browser fully, might not understand the web and all these APIs and systems fully, how can we make them productive and to deliver as effectively as possible? I think things like React do a great job of that. And I think that there is a third tier of how do we help the best people deliver the best possible thing? And I think Alex is a great resource for those types of things. I don't know how much those things are going to be the future because I see less and less of them adopted every day. And I see much more interest shifting down that pipe towards the newer developers and the non-developers and how we can empower them. That does firmly seem to be the future. I don't necessarily think it should be. There's a lot of value in things that make the web better for people who really know how to deliver with web standards. But the reality is we are shifting in that direction, and the tools that are able to serve people in those sections are probably going to do better, just judging by the market trends right now.
All right, I think that about wraps it up. Let's give it one more round of applause for Alex Russell and Theo Browne.